The door didn't creak when Jimin Suran walked through it. Doors didn't dare make noise around him. He moved through the entrance of his father's Baltimore estate, the way he moved through everything like the room owed him silence. Brioni jacket, dark as the hour, hands loose at his sides, eyes already scanning. It was always a habit. 12 years of never fully relaxing in any space had wired it into him permanently. He had built 12 years of silence around himself, expensive, deliberate silence, and the world had learned to cooperate. His face was unreadable, the way they had done in every room since he was 18, and decided the world was something to be controlled rather than experienced. He was halfway down the hallway when he smelled it. Food. Real food. Not coal platters left by house staff under silver covers. Something warm. Something cooked by a person standing at a stove, paying attention. He stopped. The kitchen light was on. Jimin walked to the doorway and stood there, and the woman inside hadn't heard him yet. She was on her toes reaching for the high shelf, one hand braced against the cabinet, the other stretching for a glass. Her silk headscarf was coming undone. She didn't rush to fix it. The moment it slipped completely, her dark hair spilled across her shoulders in a single unhurried wave, and she caught the scarf with 2 fingers, set it on the counter, and kept reaching for the glass, like the interruption had never happened, like nothing in the world could rush her. Jimin cleared his throat. She was completely unbothered, humming softly under her breath, and in the 10 seconds before she turned around, Jimin Suran felt the ground shift under him for the first time in 12 years. He had no idea, standing in that doorway with his car keys still in his hand, that everything was about to change. He had no idea that his father had planned it that way. Welcome back, my lovely family. Thank you so much for all the sweet comments and likes on every post. Thank you for trusting this channel. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Chapter 1. She turned when he cleared his throat, and the first thing that hit him was not that she was beautiful, though she was, undeniably, the kind of beautiful that reorganizes a room just by existing in it. It was her eyes, steady, warm, not a single trace of the flinch he was used to producing in people without trying. "You must be Jimin," she said, not a question, a fact she had already made peace with. "I'm Camila, your father's wife." The words landed like a building, coming down not in an explosion, but in a slow, structural collapse. Jimin stood in that doorway and felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, like the ground had moved without asking permission. He found Hans Suran in the study. His father sat behind his desk, silver-haired and unhurried, the picture of a man who had been expecting this conversation and decided not to dread it. "How long?" Jimin said. He didn't sit down. 6 months. 6 months. He let the number sit in the air. "And you told me by letting me walk into the kitchen. I was going to tell you at dinner, like a family. She's 25. I know how old she is. She works at a community centre." Jimin's eyes narrowed. "She doesn't have money, so what does she want with you?" Hans set his pen down. "She wants what she already has. Someone who listens. A home that feels like one. That's all she's ever asked for." Jimin said nothing. "You haven't asked me if I'm happy," Hans said. The room held its breath. "Are you?" Jimin said finally. "Yes." No hesitation. Not a single second. For the first time in 11 years, yes. Jimin picked up his keys and turned for the hallway and nearly walked directly into Camila, who was carrying 2 mugs of tea and moving with the same unhurried certainty she'd had in the kitchen. She looked at his face, really looked, the way people rarely did, and something in her expression shifted, not to pity, not to sympathy, just to recognition, like she had seen this kind of pain before and knew better than to speak over it. She held out one of the mugs. "I made enough," she said simply. He stared at her. She didn't explain, didn't wait for his approval, just held it out like it was an ordinary Tuesday. He took it. He had no idea why. She moved past him toward the kitchen, and Jimin stood alone in the hallway of the house he grew up in, holding green tea, feeling like everything he had built over 12 years had just been quietly rearranged by a woman he had known for 6 minutes. Chapter 2. He stayed 2 days, told himself it was to understand what she was, what angle she was running. What he found was nothing he was prepared for. Camila didn't perform. She didn't soften herself to make him comfortable or try to win him with effort. She simply moved through the house with intention and quiet, and the kind of certainty that had nothing to prove. The second evening, she cooked miyeokguk, Korean seaweed soup. Han had written the recipe for her in his own handwriting, margins filled with notes in both Korean and English. Jimin found out later from his father quietly, while Camila was still at the stove, that she had practiced it 4 times. She wanted it to taste like yours did growing up, Han said. I found the drafts in her notebook. Jimin sat at the dining table and picked up his spoon. The first mouthful locked something in his throat. It tasted like his mother's. Not similar, not reminiscent, like hers. The exact proportion of sesame, the precise depth of the broth. Jimin sat at that table and felt 11 years of something he had never let himself grieve, move through him like a tide, and he couldn't speak, and he didn't move. Too salty? Camila asked, not nervous, just checking. No, he said. It's right. She nodded and went back to eating. She didn't make it a moment. She let it be what it was and moved on, and that was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in years. That night, he sat alone on the back terrace watching the Baltimore harbour. He heard the door slide open and didn't turn. He already knew her footsteps. Quiet, deliberate, never intrusive. She sat in the chair beside his without asking and looked at the water. You run the syndicate, she said. Everything in him went still. Han told me, she said. He doesn't keep secrets from me. That's one of the reasons I said yes. Doesn't that frighten you? Lots of things frighten me. That just means I'm paying attention. She paused. I stopped sorting people by what they've done a long time ago. I sort them by whether they want to be different. Silence settled between them, open in it, something that hadn't been there an hour ago. Do you? She asked quietly. He looked at her. The harbour moved behind her. I don't know, he said, and he meant it completely. For the first time in 12 years, an honest answer with no strategy behind it. She nodded like that. Was enough. Like she had heard harder things and given them room to exist. They sat on that terrace for another full hour without speaking. When Jimin finally went inside, he understood, with the cold, precise clarity of a man who had built his life on reading situations before they became problems, that something had already started. Something he had not authorized. Something that did not care about authorization. Chapter 3. He came back 4 days later, told himself it was business. Han's Maryland holdings were restructuring. He arrived 2 hours before any meeting was scheduled. Camila was at the kitchen counter in a burgundy wrap dress, dark hair pinned up, phone in one hand, toast in the other. She heard him come in, glanced up. Coffee's still hot, she said, and went back to reading. He poured himself a cup. That was all. That was somehow everything. He drove her to the crisis centre when her car was in for repair. On the drive, she told him about a 17-year-old boy, 4 years of silence between him and his father. One violent night, neither knew how to walk back from. Can you fix it? Jimin asked. I can give them a room and a reason to try. The rest is on them. Does that bother you, not being able to guarantee the outcome? Everything in my life is about guaranteeing outcomes. How's that working for you? He almost smiled. She caught it. There it is, she said softly, and looked out the window. He started showing up earlier, staying later. Once, when the hallway light flickered, he spent 40 minutes fixing it with tools he barely knew how to use, cutting his hand in the process. You could have called someone, Camila said, finding him at it. I know, he said, but you're here. I don't want things breaking down around you. She took his hand without a word and wrapped it properly. It was the first time she had touched him. It lasted 11 seconds. He counted without meaning to. Chapter 4. It was Park Seojun who told him. Jimin's most trusted lieutenant arrived at the Seoul office with the particular careful expression of a man who has already decided that what he is about to say cannot be unsaid, and wants the other person to have one final second of not knowing. He sat down and folded his hands. 8 months ago, Seojun said, the Kwon family put a contract on you. The room didn't move. Jimin didn't move. Your father found out before we did. He negotiated directly. The price of calling it off was an alliance, a public marriage that would signal peace, an integration of Han Suran's legitimate empire as neutral ground between the factions. Seojun paused. Camila Wilson was not chosen randomly. Your father watched her for 3 months before he introduced himself. Strong enough to handle the world she'd be walking into. Grounded, someone who wouldn't break. Jimin said nothing. He fell in love with her. That part is real. But the marriage was also armor. Seojun held his gaze. For you. She has no idea. Jimin drove back to Baltimore at 4 in the morning. He sat on the back terrace until the harbour went from black to grey to gold. Then the door opened behind him. He didn't turn. He had memorized her footsteps without meaning. To the way you memorize things that matter before you've admitted they matter. Camilla took one look at his face and set her tea down. What happened? No softening. Just the question, direct as a hand reaching through dark water. He told her everything. The hit. The negotiation. The 3 months Han had spent watching her before he walked into her centre. The way she had been moved into position like a piece on a board, even while the love was real. She didn't cry. She stood at the railing with both hands flat on the stone and looked at the harbour and didn't move. He loves you, Jimin said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I've watched him. He is happier than I have seen him since my mother was alive. That doesn't change what he did, she said quietly. No, it doesn't. She turned, and in her eyes was not just hurt. There was something fiercer underneath it. The particular anger of a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated and has learned to stand inside it without collapsing. He used me to protect you, she said. Not an accusation. A fact laid on a table. Yes. Are you okay? She asked. He stared at her, in the middle of her own betrayal, with her world just restructured around a lie she hadn't known she was living inside. She was asking if he was okay. The last wall came down. No, he said, and stopped himself before he said the rest, because he had no right to say it. Not here, not now. She watched him stop. She saw all of it. She always saw all of it. I need to talk to your father, she said quietly. I know. She picked up her tea and went inside. Jimin stood at the railing and looked at the harbour and breathed. Chapter 5. Han didn't deny a single word. He sat across from Camilla in his study with his hands folded and his face carrying the full weight of what he had done. He let her say every true thing without interrupting. You chose me, she said, not just because you loved me. You needed a wife for a negotiation. Both things are true, Han said. And I know that doesn't make the second one right. No, it doesn't. I watched my son disappearing into a world I couldn't follow him into, Han said, his voice dropping. And the people in that world had decided to end his life. I couldn't tell Jimin he would have gone to war and gotten himself killed. I did the only thing I could think of. I found a way to protect him that didn't require his permission. I fell in love with you, he continued, genuinely, completely. You know that. I believe you, she said. That's what makes this harder. Are you leaving? He asked. She sat with the question. Let it be real. I don't know yet. I need space to decide without pressure. Whatever you need, he said immediately. Take whatever you need. She stood and stopped at the door. Han, did Jimin know? Before last night? Han's expression answered before his voice did. No, never. If he had known, he would have burned the whole arrangement down before it started. She believed that. Instantly. Completely. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th morning, she came downstairs, made coffee, and stood in Han's kitchen and, realized it felt like hers, that the house felt like hers, that the family she had stumbled into, broken and complicated and unexpectedly real, felt like something she was not willing to walk away from. She was still there when Jimin came downstairs. He saw her at the counter. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but they both understood. That same week, Jimin drove to her crisis centre on a Tuesday. Through the small glass panel in the door, he could see her sitting in a circle of teenagers, leaning forward, giving Abir her complete and total presence, not just attention, her whole self. He stood at that door for 4 minutes, didn't go in. He left an envelope at the front desk. No name, no note. A cashier's cheque for $400,000, 2 full years of operating funds. He had noticed the failing HVAC, the ceiling tiles, the way she stretched the budget across every crack, because the work mattered more than the infrastructure, she called that evening. That was you, she said. The building needed a new HVAC system. Jimin. And the ceiling tiles in the second hallway need replacing before winter. Silence. Then, come to dinner, tonight. All 3 of us. He came. The 3 of them sat at the long table. Silences between them stretched, and then softened into something different. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but of people learning they didn't always have to fill the air. Then Camila looked at Jimin across the table and asked, "What does Seoul look like in spring?" And Jimin Suran, who had not described anything with genuine feeling in longer than he could remember, told her about the Cheongyecheon. The cherry blossoms lining the stream in April, the way the city smelled different. The light on the Han River at 6 in the morning when the world wasn't watching. He talked for 4 minutes without realizing it. Han was looking at his coffee cup, jaw working the way it did when he was holding something in. Camila was looking at Jimin like she had just seen a room she hadn't known existed inside a house she thought she'd already mapped. Chapter 6. 3 weeks later, Han Suran collapsed in his study. Jimin was on a plane from Seoul in under an hour. He walked into the hospital room and stopped. Camila was already there, both hands wrapped around Han's, head bowed, not performing calm, carrying it. The deep and genuine steadiness of a woman who had sat with people in their worst moments, her entire adult life, and knew that presence was the only thing that ever truly helped. Jimin crossed to the other side of the bed and took his father's other hand without a word. Han opened his eyes, looked left at Camila, looked right at Jimin, and in the pale wash of hospital light, with monitors beeping softly, he said barely above a whisper, "My family." Jimin pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Camila reached across Han and placed her hand over Jimin's. 1 second. Then she pulled it back. That was all. It was everything. Han recovered. 3 weeks later, well enough to sit on the terrace, he asked Jimin to stay after dinner. Just the 2 of them. Coffee going cold. Harbour gold in the autumn light. "I see how you look at her," Han said. Jimin said nothing. "I've seen it for months." Han turned to face his son fully. "I am 61 years old. I just had a heart attack. I'm not a man who loves his pride more than his son." His voice carried grief, but also something steady beneath it. The settled peace of a man who has accepted a true thing. "She gave me back my life, laughter in this house, meaning I will be grateful for that until I die." He placed his hand on Jimin's arm. "But you are not the same person you were when she arrived. I watched you become someone different. I watched you do it without being asked." His grip tightened once. "You have my blessing. Whenever, if ever, whatever form it takes, you have it." Jimin's eyes were very bright. "Appa, go," Han said quietly. "She's on the terrace." He meant it the way only a father can say go, not as dismissal, but as the most generous thing a man can offer. A direction towards something better than where he's standing. She was on the terrace, standing at the railing, looking at the harbour. She turned before he reached her. She had always heard him coming. He sat beside her. No strategy. No armour assembled for the occasion. Just Jimin. Whatever that was now. "I built my whole life on taking what I wanted," he said. "I never asked. I never waited. I never earned a single thing." He looked at his hands. "Then you walked into this house and looked at me like I was a person, and not a force of nature, and I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't." His voice dropped. "You made me want to earn something for the first time, not because you asked me to, just because of how you exist, just because you stood in that kitchen the first night and held out a cup of tea and didn't wait for my permission to be exactly who you are." Camila was very still. "I love you," he said. "That's the true thing. I love you, and I have no right to. And I'm saying it anyway, because you taught me that saying honest things, even when they're inconvenient, is the only version of myself I want to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "I knew," she said quietly. "The night you told me about the contract. When you were angrier about it than I was, I knew then." "Knew what?" "That you loved me." She held his gaze. "And I knew something else." He waited. "That I loved you back." And I sat with that for 3 days before I decided that the scariest thing wasn't the feeling. The scariest thing was the idea of walking away from a man who was becoming someone extraordinary right in front of my eyes. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright. I would walk into that kitchen 1,000 times to find my way to this. Jimin reached across and took her hand. She let him. They sat in the dark, with the lights of Baltimore below them, and everything that had broken and been rebuilt between them settling into something solid, something true, something that didn't need another word to be completely real. Chapter 7. 6 months later, it was April in Seoul. The Cheongyecheon stream was lined with cherry blossoms, exactly as Jimin had described, pink and reckless and heartbreakingly brief, blooming like they had no idea the world would keep moving after they were gone. The ceremony was in a private courtyard near the river. Stone walls, lantern light threaded through branches overhead, chairs on either side of a petal-lined path, and at the end of that path, an altar. The guests arrived early. Park Seojun came first. The man who had delivered the news about the hit and watched Jimin drive to Baltimore at 4 in the morning. He sat in the second row and straightened his tie 3 times. He was not a man who fidgeted. He hadn't known what to do with his hands since he walked into that courtyard and understood that today was real. Beside him sat Director Choi, 9 years at Jimin's side in rooms with no windows and no records. He had seen Jimin end negotiations with a single look, had watched him walk through situations that would have broken most men without his expression changing once. When Seojun had called to tell him about the wedding, there had been 4 full seconds of silence before he responded. "He's actually doing it. He's actually doing it," Seojun had confirmed. They were both still processing it. Behind them sat others, a school friend who hadn't seen Jimin smile in 11 years, colleagues who had sat across from him in boardrooms and knew they were in the presence of someone who had decided long ago that warmth was a liability. And in the third row, 3 women from the Baltimore Crisis Center, Camilla's colleagues, the ones who had covered her shifts and asked no questions. One of them had driven past the estate months ago and seen through the gate a man in a dark jacket fixing a porch light in the rain at 11 at night. She had told the others. They had all said the same thing. She found someone who fixes things. They were all here now, all of them in that courtyard in the April light with blossoms drifting softly overhead, waiting for something none of them had been sure they would live to see. Han Suran stood at the entrance in a charcoal Hermenegildo Zegna suit that Camila had chosen for him herself, because she had noticed he always dressed for function and never for the occasion of being loved, and she had decided that was going to change. He stood straight. He looked like a man who had done something hard and costly and was at peace with every cent of the price. When Camila appeared at the entrance, the courtyard went quiet, not because of the dress, though the Giambattista Valley ivory gown was breathtaking, sleek and clean with an open back, nothing performing. Not because of the single stem of cherry blossom she carried, pale pink against her dark fingers, instead of any elaborate bouquet. The courtyard went quiet because of how she moved, unhurried, unafraid, exactly herself, Her dark hair was down, all the way down, loose across her shoulders, the way it had been that very first night in the kitchen when the headscarf slipped and she didn't rush to catch it. Han looked at her, and something moved across his face that no one could fully name. Grief and pride and relief and love all arriving at once. His arm was steady when she took it. "You look like a dream," he said. "You helped build it," she said, and meant it in every possible way. He didn't speak after that. He just walked. The school friend was gripping his own knee, watching Jimin at the altar. He was thinking about the boy he used to know before the armor went on. The boy who used to laugh until his voice gave out. He was thinking, there he is. She found him. Jimin stood at the altar in a keton suit, the colour of midnight, with his hands clasped in front of him and his face completely, entirely open. He saw her the moment she stepped through the entrance, and every person in that courtyard watched the most feared man they knew go completely still. 2 seconds. 3. His jaw worked. His eyes went very bright. He didn't reassemble himself into anything composed. He just looked at her the way a man looks when he sees the exact shape of the life he almost didn't choose. Seojun pressed his fist briefly to his mouth. Director Choi, who had not cried at his own wedding, felt something move behind his eyes and looked at the blossoms instead. Han placed a hand in Jimin's and stepped back, took his seat beside Patrick in the front row. Patrick was wearing the suit Jimin had taken him to get fitted for, the one Patrick had spent the entire fitting insisting he was absolutely going to cry at the wedding. Jimin had said nothing, just paid for the suit. The officiant spoke, the blossoms drifted down, the city breathed, and then it was time for vows. Jimin held Camilla's hands in both of his and looked at her, and the courtyard went perfectly still. Seojun and Director Choi, the school friend, the women from the crisis center, every person who had known Jimin from a distance and understood his power but never his interior, all of them leaning in, barely breathing. "You were the first honest thing in my life," he said. Low. Only for her, though the quiet of the courtyard carried it everywhere. "The first person who looked at me and saw someone worth becoming. I didn't believe it when you started. I believe it now. I will spend whatever time I have making sure you never doubt that you were worth every hard thing it took to get here." The school friend put his hand over his face. Camilla's eyes spilled over. She did not look away. "You walked into a broken house," she said, voice steady through the tears. "And you didn't know it was broken because you had grown up thinking cold and quiet was just what houses felt like. You became someone different, not because I asked you to, but because somewhere underneath all that armor there was always a man worth finding. I just refused to look away long enough for you to hide him again." She squeezed his hands. "You are the bravest thing I've ever watched happen, and I would walk into that kitchen 1,000 times to find my way to this." One of the women from the crisis center mouthed to the one beside her. She walked into a kitchen and her colleague nodded because she knew the whole story. And there was something about hearing it reduced to that one image that made it feel like the most human story ever told. Han, in the front row, pressed 2 fingers to his mouth. Patrick leaned over. "You said you weren't going to cry, old man." Han laughed. Sudden and helpless and real, the laugh of a man who had been holding too much for too long and found release in the most unexpected form. It moved through the courtyard like a warm current, and every person in those seats smiled, because it was the right sound, the sound of a family that had survived itself and come out the other side as something better. The officiant gave the word. Jimin lifted Camilla's face with both hands slowly, like something precious, like something finally where it had always belonged, and kissed her in the April light of Seoul, with blossoms coming down around them and the whole courtyard watching and not caring that they were watching, because some things are meant to be witnessed. The applause came from everywhere at once. Seojun was on his feet. Director Choi, who had not stood at his own wedding, was standing. The school friend was clapping with his eyes still wet. The crisis center, women were holding each other. Han was standing with Patrick's arm around him, laughing and crying at the same time, the way that only happens when something you were afraid you'd never see becomes real right in front of you. When they pulled back, Camila was laughing through her tears. Jimin pressed his forehead to hers. His eyes were closed. His hands were still holding her face. He breathed her in. All of it. Every part of it. The house that smelled like food for the first time in 11 years. The terrace at 4 in the morning. The soup tasted like his mother's. The hand in the hospital room. The coffee was still hot. The steady eyes that never flinched. The woman who had stood in a kitchen reaching for a glass turned around and looked at the most feared man in 2 cities, like he was someone who still had time to become himself. She had been right. Han watched it all from the front row. His son's face, the blossoms, the people on their feet, and sat with the full weight of everything he had done, the deal, the arrangement, the plan that started as survival and became something no one could have planned. He had placed a bet on his son's soul, and against every odd, in spite of every compromise and every hard thing it cost, he had won. Not at power, not at legacy, at something rarer, something that lasts. He had given his son a way home, and in the end, that was the only thing that had ever mattered. Thank you if you have made it this far. If you love this story and you have learned something from it, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, and comment for more stories like this one. The end.